Thanks, Mike. I thought I would start with a little bit of a disclaimer, because this is kind of an unusual presentation, I think, for people who are used to hearing technical expositions about software and productivity and what are better ways to work in teams. This is going to be about animals, and it's also going to be just a little bit about sex. So I know that some people might be offended by that, and I understand. It's not my intent to run over anyone's religious beliefs or be offensive. So I know if I were giving this in person, I would say, it's okay if you want to just get up and leave. But since I know you're out there listening, you can always turn it off and go home. A lot of people ask me when I give this talk, well, Linda, this is kind of unusual for you. How did you get interested in these very special animals? So I'm going to tell you a little story. When I'm home and not on the road, I spend a fair amount of time in my exercise room. And when I'm there, I listen to NPR radio broadcasts. And one afternoon I was listening, and I heard an interview with Frans de Waal. He's a very famous primatologist who's written a lot of books for the general reader. And he had a new one coming out called Our Inner Ape. If you find that the topic of this presentation is of interest to you and you'd like to know more, that would be a very good place to start. It's a very readable, a very interesting book. And what Frans de Waal is saying in it is that we've looked to the past to a particular animal for our model for human behavior, the chimpanzee. In fact, we've known for quite some time, even before we could look at the DNA, that the chimpanzee was very closely related to us. Now, of course, we see exactly how close. So the book points to another animal that's also closely related to us, the bonobo. And in fact, as it turns out, the bonobo and the chimpanzee are equally close, but they have very different cultures. So it piqued my interest. I bought the book. I read it. And while I was reading it, I had an epiphany. I think this helps understand a little bit of why agile development is so successful. So the first question is, what's a bonobo? And it's a question I had. It's probably a question that you're having right now. So here's a picture of a couple of bonobos. And if I could interact with you, I would ask you, what do you notice about these two animals? So here are some responses I typically get. One, they're standing upright. They do look a little bit like chimpanzees, but they're different in that we think of chimpanzees and gorillas as animals that move around mostly on all fours, whereas the bonobo skeleton is very different. It's closer to ours. The way the pelvis is joined to the spine means that the bonobo is more comfortable standing upright. And of course that means they look a lot more like us. One thing that you sort of can see in this picture is that the hair on top of the head looks as though it has a little part in it, as though the bonobo spent time in the morning before the mirror with brush in hand trying to make himself look neat. There's the sort of typical chimpanzee bonobo stance with long arms, and we'll have a look at some comparisons so that we can look at how different they are. This is a baby. Aw, it's a baby bonobo. I think maybe you can see the part here pretty clearly, and you can see the dark face. Let's have a look at this is a chimpanzee baby. I'm going to go back and forth and see if you can have a look at those two animals. That's the baby bonobo. That's a baby chimp. Someone said he looks like George Bush. He has definitely got ears, doesn't he? Whereas the ears in the bonobo, more laid back. You can also see the baby bonobo has a dark face. Bonobos are born with black faces. whereas chimpanzees are born with white faces that become dark over time. They're both cute, though, aren't they? Here's an adult chimp. If you can cast back to the adult bonobos, the chimp has a squarer, more muscular build. They are typically larger than bonobos. In fact, way back when, before we realized that the bonobos and the chimpanzees were different species, the bonobos were thought to be chimpanzees that were just smaller. And in fact, if you go to some zoos today, the bonobo is simply labeled pygmy chimpanzee. They're more delicate. They're less muscular. This chimp doesn't even look as though he has a neck. So they have a squarer build. They're typically found on all fours. So they have a very different appearance from the bonobo. And this is not a faked photo. This bonobo is actually balancing on one foot while eating. They are very agile. They're graceful. They're acrobats. They move around with a more delicate grace and balance, whereas the chimpanzee is more comfortable on the ground and is slower moving. So some of you may or may not know that we're talking about apes. These are not monkeys. That's a different genus. And there are several great apes: the gibbon, the siamang, the orangutan, gorilla, chimpanzee, and bonobo. Someone has suggested that perhaps we should be included in that gathering, that maybe we are the seventh ape. It's interesting that bonobos were identified as a separate species very late, not until 1929. I think it's one reason why there are so many bonobos in European zoos is that the scientists who identified them first were German. There are bonobos in American zoos. In fact, just last week, I went with my daughter to Memphis, Tennessee, and looked at a small community of bonobos there. Most American zoos do not have bonobos. I'm not exactly sure why, but I can guess. This is the important part. 99.4%. How close we are. We're equally close to chimpanzees and bonobos, both 99.4%. They're not identical, of course, but they're very close to each other. They're very similar species. But goodness, given that very close makeup of DNA, we're still obviously different, aren't we? Now, this has been a struggle for biologists for a long time. How is it that we define ourselves as being separate from the apes? Clearly, there are differences. No one would argue that. But what is the difference exactly? Scientists are always looking for some clear way to define how we are different from the apes. And of course, way back when, it was man is the tool maker. So I could ask at this point for a show of hands, how many have heard of Jane Goodall? And I think in most audiences I get 100% as a response. Most people know who Jane Goodall is. She's a very famous biologist who started her career when she was just a secretary working with Louis B. Leakey. And he suggested that if she wanted a project on her own, she should go to Africa and simply observe chimpanzees. So she did. And when she gave her very first scientific paper at a gathering of the Royal Society, she was